Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, a regulatory landscape, and capital markets. This segment is presented by Charles Schwab. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining us this afternoon, we have Jim Watson, partner of the litigation practice at Ice Miller, Dan Law, head of cyber practice at HSB, as well as John Farley, managing director of the cyber liability practice at Gallagher. We're here to discuss cybersecurity response planning in a rapidly evolving tech environment that's still heavily reliant on the human element. It is great to have all of you with us for Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which of course takes place each October. Jim, let's kick this off. Give us a high-level overview of the threat environment as we know it now. What's keeping you up at night?
Jill, thanks for having me. Boy, I tell you, the threat environment now is something like we've never seen. And with the government shutdown, I think what companies and businesses really need to keep in mind that it's really more important than ever that they look at themselves for gaps and risks. There are threat actors, nation states out there that are working harder than ever during this shutdown to get at them because they watch the news too, and they know how vulnerable we are now.
Yeah. And, Dan, when we think about the emerging technologies that are being employed, such as AI today, the good and the bad actors are both leveraging the same type of technology, which only adds more complexity to the environment.
They certainly are. And again, thanks for having me, Jill. The AI from a threat actor perspective makes it a lot harder to detect how they're trying to get into businesses. You used to be able to rely on verbiage usage or voice communication with executives at your company, and a lot of that can be cloned now. So it's very tough to tell when it's AI coming from a threat actor or something that's valid and internal.
Yeah. John, especially when the human element still really remains on the front line of cybersecurity planning.
Sure thing. The human is really the firewall, right, to start. But really, when you look at emerging technology, you look at deep fake technology, right? So now you have synthetic media, whether it's fake audio or fake video, that is every day it gets better, right? So what we had a year ago is just so much more convincing. And so that human has to figure out, is that authentic or not? Is that really my CEO who just left me a voicemail asking me to transfer $1 million? Sounded a lot like him. His voice was scraped from an earnings call and now manipulated to sort of carry out today's modern social engineering attacks. And so now it's up to the person to try to figure that out. But also we're seeing companies bring in new technology to help them identify anomalies in video or some alterations of noise patterns in voice. So it's really going to be a combination of human intuition and the latest technology to defeat this kind of attack.
It's incredible how easy they make it seem as well. We actually did an ethical hacking panel on this show, and the introduction was a fake Jill doing the introduction, and then we cut right over to me, and they did it in under an hour. They were able to create this 10-second file. So certainly, to your point, this can move markets. It can spark heightened geopolitical situations and so forth, and it's just moving at such a rapid environment. So, Jim, when you're thinking about your incident response planning, where do you even start? How do you engage with all the stakeholders?
Oh yeah, it's the little things. Companies are so worried about AI and quantum computing and nation state attacks that they tend to miss the little things like no use of multi-factor authentication, bad password hygiene, not using out-of-band verifications when that vendor sends new payment instructions with a new account. Pick up the phone, call those folks who you know and you've worked with for years, and make sure they're the ones who sent you those change of account information and not the threat actor.
Yeah. I also think part of the challenge too, Dan, is these technologies are evolving quicker than the regulatory environment can evolve. And a lot of the governance falls on the companies, and it runs the risk of a ticking exercise versus being able to implement proactive solutions and really focus on the cyber side of it.
It certainly does. I mean, it creates a very dynamic environment that staying cognizant of. I think partnering with the right outside vendors or third parties to keep businesses abreast of these changes is of critical importance. So making sure that you are bringing in the experts. Can't rely on every small business out there to be an expert in all of the space and the regulations that change here. So certainly bringing in appropriate parties there, but also meeting on this internally frequently. I think utilizing roundtable exercises, taking the precautionary, knowing what you're going to do when an event does happen is critical to a successful process in navigating a cyber event when it does take place. I mean, we've had 4 high-profile events in the past 2 weeks where some of them are threat actor based, some of them are not. But either way, some of these incident response plans should be spun up by these businesses. Knowing how to react is critical.
Yeah, it certainly is. And John, I think part of it too is that enterprise needs to think with a cyber first mindset in its culture from the top down, because at the end of the day, there really is no standardization. So when you're thinking about, building your policy and developing your response plan, is there any way to standardize it? Are there frameworks in place to help teams build this out?
Well, I think what you have to do is identify key stakeholders within your organization that are all going to play a certain part in an incident response. So that could be your general counsel, that could be someone from the IT department, someone from operations, someone from public relations, and others. And essentially, you're all going to have a specific role to react as the crisis unfolds. And you're going to have to know how to act depending on the type of incident you have. So it could be a ransomware attack. Are we going to pay a ransom? If we do, what do we say about that? What are we doing about tracking the digital footprints of the hacker to make sure they're out? And who are we teaming with on the outside, right? So you might have an IT forensic investigator that's brought in to help your IT person really figure all that out. Your general counsel may have to reach out to a breach coach to understand what their compliance obligations are to both the state, federal, and even the international regulatory bodies that may be involved in a regulatory investigation. So lots of things happening at once, but if everybody understands their role, executes on that role, and practices these types of attacks before the real thing occurs, I think you're going to be in a much better place than you would be otherwise.
Yeah. Jim, what about engaging with law enforcement? It's okay, you have a point in your notes here. You don't call the fire department or figure out how to start your response planning in the middle of a situation.
Right. And this builds off of what Dan and John both said. I can't tell you how many times when I was a cybercrime supervisor that I'd get a call from a company and it's their worst day ever, right? They're watching their data flow out and they call the FBI and said, help. And that's not the time to call the FBI. They're not the fire department. They can't put the fire out. But what I'm hoping that folks will think of, specifically the FBI and law enforcement in general, as the fire marshal. They're willing to talk to most companies ahead of time about what they're looking for, things to be on the lookout for, particular threat actors that we're worried about at that particular time. And then after an incident, if after consultation with general counsel and your team, you feel like you need to go to law enforcement, then you can provide that data to them and they can take that data, and whether it's through the Internet Crime Complaint Center or it's an open investigation that they already have, they're taking that information, hopefully in an attempt to get back whatever data that you may have lost. But do not think of law enforcement at the time that your data is flowing out. They're not the fire department.
Yeah. So, well, Jim, in other words, it's basically, this isn't something that you set and forget. It's an ongoing thing, like fire drills and preparedness, in other words.
Absolutely. Having those conversations ahead of time are really important. Most people don't think to call the police until something bad has happened. But in this case, having those conversations ahead of time with your local FBI office, your local cyber agents is really important, because at the end of the day, there's more art to being a cyber agent than science. And I think knowing who your local cyber agent that's going to respond to you is important. And having that connectivity will help you in the long run.
Yeah. John, what about mitigating disruptions, right? We had a near miss at the UN in September, and the importance of redundancies and backup.
Right, exactly. You're going to have to pivot sometimes to use, and sometimes it's a vendor that goes down. It may not even be an attack against you, but you have to think about all sorts of things that can occur. And if it does, how am I going to pivot and how am I going to keep running? It's all about redundancy, and timing is of the essence. The longer you're down, the more it's going to cost. There's going to be financial pain. There'll be reputational harm. And so having those sort of contingencies ready to go at the outset is so important. I know that's easier said than done, but if there's enough planning involved, you certainly can go a long way to mitigating both the financial and reputational harm that certainly will happen after an incident.
Yeah, I also think, Dan, part of changing the culture and the mindset is learning to operate outside of silos so that you're able to manage and mitigate and see where the gaps exist across the organization.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's just critical, especially in a cyber incident when it can affect so many different facets of the business. Operational technology on one side, critical information systems on another side. You've got to there's so many different experts involved that you really have to have. The scope of the team and the incident response team has to be broader than just those particular silos. It's not an IT problem. It's a human problem. It is a legal problem. There are ramifications beyond just a particular silo. So getting in a cross-functional team is critical to success.
Yeah, Dan, it certainly is. And I also think being able to get the buy-in across the organization, whether it's the board, the C-suite, all the other teams that cyber touches, because its tentacles are everywhere. And just being able to have those conversations and get that buy-in, to your point, it isn't just the IT team that needs to care about cyber.
It is certainly a board level discussion and decision points at this point in time. You've got to get it from the top down of an organization and everybody that's critical to it, and identifying those different functional components and people that need to be involved. And again, the experts that you can bring in that are familiar with doing these things and do this repeatedly can help that business design a plan and craft something that's going to work effectively for them, because each business is unique. Different downstream technologies that they're using, outsourcing of one component versus somebody that outsources another component. So it really is important for the business to look internal and then bring in some outside experts that can help.
Yeah. John, you've also written about the compliance pitfalls of AI adoption and how that is also impacting the evolution of incident response planning. Give us some background on that if you can.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on AI incident response plans because no one's really thinking about that. We're thinking about ransomware and social engineering attacks, system failure, but we're now seeing organizations adopt AI at a really rapid pace. And so as they do that, they've got to think about what can happen if that AI output is incorrect or incomplete or flawed in some way. And if it is, that could lead to losses. So you have to start thinking about planning for that incident. So if I have a data bias situation, for example, if I'm a bank and I'm deciding, hey, I'm going to use an AI platform to decide who gets a loan, and then you realize that it's excluding a whole demographic, you're now facing a potential bias claim or class action. And you may get a regulator involved because we're starting to see the regulators pay attention to bias risk with the use of AI platforms. So what happens when that regulator comes knocking at your door and says, hey, what's happening here? How did this platform decide who's getting a loan and who isn't? You're going to have to answer that question. And you're going to have to figure out where it went wrong. Was the data poisoned in some way? Or if you're outsourcing it, if you're using a third party to provide that platform, you may have questions for them. But the regulator is going to want answers. And so think about your incident response planning for an AI platform that starts to go sideways and you have flawed outputs. So you start thinking about, hey, we're going to have a human in the loop here, validating outputs and having someone in charge of that situation. So there's a lot to think about here. And again, I think everybody's looking for the efficiencies of AI, but they're not thinking about the risks associated with it.
Well, I mean, that's a great point that you bring up. Let's use, employment law as an example. The EEOC, there's, clearly standards that companies have to adhere to, and whether it's a human or AI that is producing the output, even though there's might not be AI written into the regulation, there's still you still have to adhere to it, whether it's a human making these decisions or an AI platform.
Yeah, they'll probably consider AI as an agent of your organization, just like the HR person interviewing the person is an agent. I think so too. You can make an argument that the platform is too. It's making decisions for you. So I think you're going to see a lot of regulators focus on that for sure.
As we look forward, Jim, you've noted that the combination of generative AI and quantum computing, that can really provide for more complexity as we think about the cyber landscape going forward. Why so?
We've seen AI and the effects that it's had over generative AI over the last year. I mean, it's probably the single largest topic that we've had our clients want to engage us on. When you add that quantum computing component where it's faster, stronger, bigger, the bad guys have access to it just like the good guys. And so it makes it just that much scarier in an attempt to combat threat actors who are utilizing it. But again, I want to come back because I talk to folks all the time. In our practice, we still see the little things that if you prevent those, if you fix those, whether it's again strong password usage, multi-factor authentication, you're going to prevent the bulk of most attacks at this point. The future is a scary thing, and we all have to prepare for it. But I think today, still doing those little things will help companies combat a lot of this.
Yeah. Dan, do you think because of this rush, let's call it from, when ChatGPT, generative AI became part of the everyday vernacular, do you think the rush to get internal and external facing products out there for the sake of the competitive environment, perhaps the risk wasn't modeled or it wasn't understood? Are we starting to see gaps and vulnerabilities because of that?
We certainly see some gaps and vulnerabilities with how companies are employing these technologies without maybe a holistic approach to and standardization of how they want their employees or departments using them. So, you'll have one department of a business that they're free and clear to go engage, and they may be putting company information out there in the public domain that they shouldn't be utilizing because the companies lack policies around some of these. I always like to start from a zero trust environment and build policies around those things. But the human element, again, we've talked about it a lot today, is they want to move faster. They want to do things easier, and employing these things and these tools certainly allow them to do that. It creates risk for the business. So getting a unified approach from a zero trust perspective can be critical until somebody gets in there and is able to vet the technology and determine the actual policies and procedures around its use.
All right. Appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.